Hi there, ADIM attendees. This is Scott Valentine with a recap of the clone stamp painting technique that I showed you on the first day of the conference this year. Here's the final product, and I'd like to take apart the little details in this before I show you how to set up the document and actually work through the technique yourself. So, what we did was actually start with a reference painting right here. Let's just go to the back, right? So, when I begin painting in this area, I have a background canvas, which is just my texture layer. It's what we'll call the substrate. And then initially I laid down this reference image, and that's really just to lay down some guidelines to give me some boundaries to work with when I go through the underpainting stage. Now, to make some of this stand off a little bit easier, I also went ahead and started off with some canvas preparation by adding a gradient fill, which you can find here under Layer, New Fill Layer, Gradient. Right? And if you click OK, you get the option of selecting this gradient option here and choosing a preset. I've actually made this tobacco burst to kind of complement this style and the look that I'm going for. All right, I'll cancel out of that. And then I've also added a black filled layer and called it Gate. And the reason for this is that I can adjust the intensity of that gradient fill. Right? And I do that occasionally while I'm painting just to bring out some of the more detailed areas and see what I'm working on, because occasionally when you're painting things get pretty subtle. Now, to allow the texture to come through all of this that we had on the canvas layer, the gradient fill layer itself is set to multiply. Alright, the reference layer is painted down, and then I begin in with the underpainting. The underpainting itself is really not meant to have a whole lot of detail. It's meant to block in large shapes. So let's turn off the reference layer so we don't see the two of those combined. And this is all I've done with the clone stamp tool, is to follow the contours of the face, and I really want to leave a lot of brush strokes in there. So it's important to make the brush strokes in such a way that you imagine the painter would do. If you have a classical background in painting, this will make sense to you. But if you're like me, you kind of had to discover this by watching carefully other people paint and looking at some of the old masters for reference. So I wanted to make sure that the contours were set in place by the brush strokes itself, and that there was enough room left so that it would show through in the final product. Now, once I had the blocked in area for the underpainting, I added a little bit more detail, and you can see that fills in some of the blanks and defines a little more of the edge, but I haven't gone too far with details. For example, you can see here in the lips, it's still dominated largely by just a couple of shades and the brush strokes around the edges. Let's bring this down so we can see the eyes. Then I added in the actual detail. I was careful to leave as many hints of brush strokes as I possibly could. So you can see they're all over the place, including the whites of the eyes. And especially in bright areas, you're going to want to see some of those brush strokes, because that's really what will sell the idea that this is a painting and not a photograph. The lips now have more detail, the nose is more defined, but I haven't made things solid black, and I haven't overdone the amount of paint, the density of paint you might see. There's a little extra detail in the hair that you may or may not choose to include. That's entirely your choice. Alright, then the final thing that I did for the actual painting was the shaping layer, and that's where we get a lot of that classical look, right? We increase dynamics, we deepen the shadows quite a bit, and I've added a little bit of tonal variation in here. And it sometimes will show through the final color layer, but not always, so don't get too hung up on it. The secret to doing this shaping is to simply change the blending modes, either of the tool, the clone stamp tool that you're using, or changing the layer blending modes in the source document. But you can see all that shaping happens just on one layer. Okay? Right. Now, once the painting is generally complete, we'll add a color fill layer, which is also the same place as the gradient fill. Layer, new fill, solid color, and you get to choose your color. And one of the reasons I like fill layers rather than actually just filling with pixels is that I get to change it. If I double click on this, I can now drag around and see the effects in real time rather than having to keep backspacing and filling. And if I didn't like the change that I made, now I just have to hold on the Option or Alt key and set Reset, and I go back to where I started. So I can experiment without fear of losing my information. Next up, I have a set of dodge and burn tools, and that helps me work the entire image and give more shape to the face. And again, I'm trying to emphasize and pull out the areas that are very curved to give them a lot of dimensionality. This is the chiaroscuro of the image, the balance between light and dark. Now finally, we need to age it quite a bit, so I'll zoom in. And I've treated the texture in two different ways. The first one is the face texture, right? And it's actually set to color burn blend mode, and it's sampled in just the same way that we're going to sample in the basic painting. But I also went ahead and added a mask in this case. This is something that I didn't show in the conference, but sometimes it really helps. This mask is simply a clouds layer, render, filter, clouds, or filter, render, clouds, right? And then I blurred it. And that gave me a mottled effect to the texture. So it's not uniform. And one of the things you'll see about some of these textures, depending on the style you choose, it's not going to behave the same all across the surface of your image. And we'll look at some other ways to control that also. Finally, up in the left corner here, you'll see the application of the canvas texture. And again, that's a little more subtle. The scale of the texture is quite a bit different. And that's there to help sell the overall idea that the entire image was painted a long time ago. Alright, so let's go ahead and set up our image. Now if you can keep some of this in mind, hopefully the rest of it will make a lot more sense. So now we need to prepare the source image. This is where I will take my sample from with the clone stamp tool, and I will adjust the blending modes in the different layers and the opacities to give me different effects while I'm painting. So starting from this image, I applied a layer mask using Topaz Remask 4. And I'm not going to go through the tutorial on that. It's actually pretty straightforward, and if it was included in your transfer files, you can give it a shot and see how easy it is when you have a simple background to knock out. I wasn't too careful about making detailed selections because the canvas itself is dark, and while I'm painting I get to control how much of this is actually included. So I'm not too worried about frizzy hairs or anything like that. I just wanted enough of a mask so that I didn't paint the background onto my canvas. Now, here's one of the tricks. To make things a little easier for blurring later on, I went ahead and applied this mask by right-clicking and choosing Apply Layer Mask. What that does is it makes the mask permanent, and when you go to blur layer on, when you go to blur later on, it keeps the background from bleeding into your subject. And that's really important when you have lighter areas like this, or maybe if you just have the edge of a face up against something darker. You don't want the background bleeding into it. You want the subject to actually dominate. So it's important to have all that happen. I then duplicated this layer. I'll hit Command or Control J. And on this layer, I'm going to call it Impression, just like you see already set up. Call it Impression 2, keep it separate. And then I'm going to use Topaz Simplify again. Filter, Topaz Labs, and Simplify 4. What this is going to do is reduce detail. So I have some presets here, but you can actually go through one of their built-in presets called Underpainting, and it's under the painting title. And you can see as you apply these, they have different levels of detail that are left. This is actually pretty nice for some portraits. I like how soft it is, but for our purposes I'm just going to use a preset collection called Renaissance Prep. And the reason I like this particular version for this image is that it's reduced even the eyes to mostly solid colors. I have a few soft transitions, but really what I'm looking for are large blocked areas. You can get some of the same effect by using surface blur in Photoshop, or even by using the lasso tool and selecting regions and then using the blur average filter. That takes a lot of time, so I highly recommend if you want to try this out, either just take the defaults for surface blur or try a plugin like this to get rid of most of that detail. And rather than render this, I'm going to cancel it because I already have the results that I want, and it can take a couple of seconds to finish out. So here we are back in Photoshop. I'm going to get rid of this layer just to keep things clean. This is the result of the impression plugin that I used, and you can see it's a little bit different than what you saw in the preview. But the important things are that I've still got these blocks of color. I have some tonal variation with a subtle gradient, but mostly I've lost the detail. Now I've taken this duplicated it again, and applied a Gaussian blur, and that's what we have here. As a matter of fact, let me turn that back to normal blending mode and turn off these others. And so you can see the result of blurring the impression plugin result gives me even softer areas. And I'll use that to fill in some details. I mostly use this for a correction layer. If I have some spots where I've gone over it in too much detail and I start getting the actual skin texture or hair texture, I'll go back with the blur layer selected and fill in some areas to obliterate some of that detail so it still has that painting effect. Now the other nice thing about using these blurs is that as you're brushing, you'll see here in just a moment, the clone stamp tool can use the bristle brushes. And these little areas that are softer on the edge, if you get a bristle from your brush kind of dragging out in there, it sort of looks like the real thing. You actually get the benefit of this soft gradient as if the artist were lifting their brush up when they come by these areas. And so pay attention to that when you're working. As you work in some of these softer areas, you get to see the effects of the bristle brush, and it really gives a lot of realism. Now, the last thing, this is my secret sauce trick here. The way to make all of this work as simply as possible is I've added a blank layer at the top, and I've, in this case, filled it with 50% gray, but it doesn't matter what color you fill it with. Just make sure every pixel on this layer is filled. And then you come to either fill or opacity and drop it to 0. Now that's a lot different than turning off the layer. What happens is you are using the clone stamp tool and it needs pixels to sample from. If you turn this layer off, there's no visible difference, but Photoshop knows there's no information for it to sample, so it can't do anything. If I turn the visibility on, but I have fill or opacity set to 0, then Photoshop is tricked into thinking it's actually sampling those pixels. Now, you have to use that in conjunction with the options for the clone stamp tool at the top here, right? So when you select the clone stamp tool, you get these options at the top, and we're going to leave these alone for the most part. I'm selecting current and below because I'm going to sample from my sample layer. And I've got this alignment checked, right? So this tells you whether or not you're going to lock the alignment. The difference here is that if you deselect this, wherever you sample on your image now becomes the starting point for your stamp. So if I were to sample over an eyeball, say, and I went to paint in my target layer, every time I pick up my stylus, I would start painting a new eyeball. However, with this enabled, this alignment enabled, now, once I lay down the first stroke, that anchors the sample for the whole image. And if I paint an eyeball, say over here on this side, and then I pick up my stylus and I move over to the other side and start painting, I will get the same distance on the other side. So I'm not painting with an eyeball, I'm painting with whatever is to the right of that eyeball, right? So we'll see how that works in just a moment. Let's go ahead and turn on the impression layer. And I'm going to, with my clone stamp tool, select a preset that I've got, which is actually just called reference. And if you look at the details of that, that reference is nothing more than a round brush set to about 400 pixels, right? It covers a lot of area, no spacing, 100% hardness. What we're going to be doing is laying down this image, let's see, not impression, I want my reference layer. We're going to be laying down this image in the target layer and using that as our boundary. All right, let's close this. I'm going to hold Option or Alt and click right in the middle of our eyeball just for a landmark. Let's close the properties and open clone source. Now you can see right now the clone source should be defaulted to 100% for the width and height, no angle, no XY offset, no frame offset, nothing else. I've also got show overlay on, and you can see right now since I've collected that sample, wherever if I touch down on the canvas, this sample will start at that point. So let's go over to my target. The target is just my canvas. And in this case, I've made sure that my source and my target are the same size. Let's take a look at that really quickly. Image size. I've got an 8x10 image at 300 dpi, and I'm sampling from an 8x10 image at 300 dpi. I'm sorry, ppi, pixels per inch, not dots, pixels per inch. Okay, so as long as the documents have the same dimension, I know that they're going to line up in here. All right. I've created a new layer, and I'm going to name it reference. And I'll just make a random paint stroke anywhere on here. As long as I only make the one stroke, it doesn't matter. But look at this offset, right? I now have minus 66 and minus 80. Or minus 66 and 80. That is the difference in location from where I sampled to where I started painting relative to these two open documents. I'm going to do Command or Control Z to undo that. And you see the offset's changed a little bit. But because I have already pre-selected alignment, I can control that offset. So 0 and 0, press Enter to deselect the box. And now as I move the marker around, you can see that I've locked down that relative position. So I'm just going to paint very broadly. I'm just scribbling. Right. There we go. Oh, very important. I'm actually using a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet for this with an art pen. Now, the reason I like the art pen is that it enables rotation, which we'll see in just a moment when I use the bristle brush. But using a mouse for this technique would be very, very difficult. You can do it, but you lose an awful lot of fidelity, and it probably will take you a lot longer. Plus, you don't get the rotation ability right off the bat. I like to work as organically as possible, and that's kind of how I came up to this technique. I just really wanted to make sure that I had a way to not think about controlling the tools, so I didn't have to futz with every little detail. All right, so my reference is in place. I'm going to lower its opacity to about 15%, something like that, just so I can barely see it. I know I'm going to be painting with a fairly low flow and opacity, so I need to give myself some visual reference. And so I'll press V to get my move tool just to make things easier on the eyes. I'm going to add my gradient fill layer just above my canvas. Click the gradient and choose my tobacco burst preset and select OK. I can leave it at linear, radial, whatever I want. Let's choose linear and change the angle. All right. Let's drag it up a little bit. I want the light source to somewhat match the reflection on her forehead. So let's play with that a little bit. There we go. That looks pretty good. Now to preserve some of that texture, let's change the blend mode of the gradient fill to multiply. And now, because it's a little bit bright and I know I'm going to want to go back and forth here, I need some darker areas. So I'm going to fill a layer with black and lower its opacity so just a little bit of the gradient comes through. There we go. Let's name that gate for good housekeeping. All right, we're ready to start laying down our underpainting. I know it takes a little bit of prep to get in there, but it's worth it at the end. Create a new layer, call it Underpainting, and now I have another brush preset. All right, so let me hit the S tool, and I have Underpainting. That is a bristle brush. It's this guy right here. All right, it's a flat fan brush down at the bottom. The bristles are about 66%. I've kept the length fairly short, and the thickness is somewhat moderate. You will have to adjust these based on the actual dimensions of your image, the texture that you want, and the look of the brush strokes. So this is where I'm starting. Go ahead and take this. A lot of it comes from the default. I've also lowered the spacing down to about 2%, just because I don't like gaps in the painting strokes. But you'll start to notice that your processor will get awfully warm as you paint like this. Go ahead and get to it. Now, because I'm going to paint the underpainting, I need to make sure that my impression layer is visible. And I'll turn off the background so that these edges are not hard. And I'll start working in on all these blocks. On the underpainting layer then, I can just start making strokes. There. I just want to follow the contours as much as possible. There we go. Just general areas. Now you notice I'm not painting at full opacity. Opacity itself is set to 25%, but very important, flow is set to about 10%. The difference is opacity locks the total opacity of the paint that you're laying down with your brush. And so no matter how many more times you scrub back and forth without picking up the pen, you won't get any more density of paint. Flow, on the other hand, does let you scrub back and forth without picking up the stylus. I encourage you to play with that if you're not already familiar with it, but for the moment, just go ahead and use these kinds of settings to slowly build up your painting. So really what I'm looking for here is to leave some of the texture below and to define the curvature of my subject. Set a little perspective in there. I don't want to fill in a whole lot. I just want to make sure that I know where the boundaries of the face and the hair are. And I want some of that texture to flow through from the canvas into my underpainting. All right, let's get a little bit of the clothing in there. Some of that highlight. And because it's a little bit hard to see down here, I'm going to temporarily turn off my black layer and the gradient fill and just make sure that I can get to her sleeves. Remember, none of this is set in stone. You just want to make sure that you are adequately defining your areas, because you're going to turn off the reference layer here in a little bit, and a lot of this detail that you see showing through is going to go away. And it's also okay to leave a lot of this unfinished. As you work in some of these details, maybe you never go back and refine any of this. You just kind of let it be a hint. Remember, if you were a painter of old, you probably had a lot of time to work on these, but if you were popular, you might have gotten a few other commissions. Darker areas could not be hidden or could not be visible anyway, so you maybe didn't spend a whole lot of time on it. And you wanted to spend the majority of your time on the details that were important. And so you'll have to make that stylistic choice. You can get as furiously detailed with it as you want, but you'll risk losing some of that texture. Okay. All right, now let's turn off the reference layer and see what we've got. I need to fill in a little bit more, so I'm going to use a smaller brush. And I need a bit more dimension on here, so I'm going to follow the contours a bit more. And you'll notice, because I've sampled from that impression result, I've still got a fairly hard edge to work with, so I want to make sure not to work that too much. I don't want it to be dominant. Just hint at that, and we can come back and soften that a little bit later. So right here I'm using the ability of the Wacom Art Pen to rotate to adjust the angle of the brush itself. You can see I can tilt it one way or another, or I can rotate it, and that adjusts how the paint strokes are laid down. And typically, if you were painting a portrait in the olden days, you would have a small variety of brushes to work with, but you wouldn't necessarily have a huge range. So try and be a little consistent as you're working through this. There we go. Okay, get some more on the forehead here. A little bit less dense over in the darker areas, fewer brush strokes. Let's get a little more base on that eye. Curve over the nose. There we go. And let's just bring out a little bit of the hair. You can see that as I'm brushing, some of those stray bristles are reaching out and grabbing some of the fuzzier areas, the softer regions, and implying brush strokes that that really helps sell the idea. And especially in things like this where you have highlights for hair, don't feel obligated to cover absolutely everything. Sometimes just working a few little spots will add a lot more dimension without a whole lot of work. It implies some really good detail, but keeps things vague. So it's a little little visual trick to use there. Okay. This is starting to come together. Smooth a few things out. And you can see the advantage here of using flow is that if let me scrub right here and not pick up the brush, if I go back and forth, I'm continuously building up. I can just keep, kind of like with a crayon, you can just keep scrubbing over that area to keep building up until you like it. You don't have to keep picking up the pen. Now when you do that, you obscure an awful lot of the individual brush strokes, so it's important to allow some overlap like you see right here. That really gets the detail in there. Gives you some good visual hints. There we go. Add a little bit more. And zoom out and see what we've got. Okay, this could probably use a little bit more work to smooth it out a bit more, but I think it serves the purpose right now. And every time you do this, it'll be a little bit differently. It's also one of the things I like about this technique is that it's very much up to the whim of the artist. However you are feeling at the moment about your painting, you can put that in there. You do the same portrait half a dozen times and you'll get half a dozen variations. But you're still in charge of all of it. Never give up control of your art to the plugins. Use them. My philosophy is that you use them as a starting point more than anything else. They should not define your art, and your tools should not constrain your art. I get to choose where all the paint is coming down here, and being a little bit of a control freak, I'm okay with that. There we go. Okay, we'll call that good enough for the underpainting. Now, let's add a mid layer. And this is going to start shaping things a little bit more detailed. So I'll go back to my source document. I'll turn off impression and turn on blur, but I'm going to do a little trick here. It doesn't matter if I select away from this sample layer, the clone source will always see everything current below. So I'm going to take the blur element and lower it down just a bit so I still have some softer areas. There we go. And there's no hard and fast rule to this. You can start with blending mode changes here. You can paint with just the blur tool to get some of these highlights, anything you like. But I'm going to put in some mid-level details here without getting into the skin texture. So let's pay attention to some of these areas that I didn't fill in. Remember, I'm painting on a new layer every time I change the focus of my details. Okay. And now you can see why it's important to try and keep the tonal values and the colors of your original image when you do the simplify step. Because if you don't, then you'll get some jarring transitions. There we go. Now I'm starting to hint at some of these shapes just by brushing over them, but still maintaining the contours. There we go. Let's give a little more to the eyeball. Bridge. There we go. Now I'm going to rotate the brush and paint down on the lips to get some of those highlights, but I want to be careful not to get too many just yet. It's okay. A little bit more. That's it. So we want some of this detail to start showing through and fill in the blanks. We also want to kind of cross that divide between realism and impression in this. We want to imply details, but we want to give just enough actual detail so that there's interest. There we go. Okay. There. Let's do a little treatment on the hair. I don't want to get too much because in the source document you can see some of these edges and fine details showing through. I want to avoid that in the hair until the last step. So I'm just going to pick out a few little areas to highlight. Let's work on that braid a little. we go. Okay. Good. So let's take a look at our starting point again, and we'll work through some of those layers. You can see that I've just completed the underpainting and the mid detail. So we've got these areas. And let's go and turn off the texture and everything else so that we don't get confused. So we're at roughly the same stage. As you can see, obviously the brush strokes are all different because you're doing them manually. But now let's add the detail. In this one I did a little too much detail, so I'm going to back off of that a bit. Let's go to my source document. We'll turn off blur, and now the sample will be looking at exactly the photographic details that we see here. Go to target. I'm going to call this one detail to help me remember that I actually did this from the photograph itself, not from the result of a filter. Make my brush smaller. Now I'm going to be very selective about picking the detail that I want to put in there. You can see those brush strokes are still being maintained, but there's some life coming into the eyes. Let's clear that up quite a bit. There we go. So in the end, it'll be some of the imperfection that that makes it perfect, right? So there's an idea called a Persian flaw. If you're not familiar with it, Persian rugs were so finely crafted at some point that some people felt it might be an offense to God that something was so perfect. So they would build in a flaw to their rug just so that they wouldn't offend the gods. And so let's leave a few Persian flaws in here. Not that I'm implying anything. There we go. And you can see as I paint here, I'm getting a little skin texture, so I have to be careful to avoid that. Let's just work a little bit here. And let's get some of the highlights around the mouth. There we go. Now we can pick out a few details in the hair, frame it, and some angled strokes on the braid to get the highlights. There we go. So I am being very selective about what details I want to actually show and what details I want to imply. All right. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I use the blur tool or the blur layer for is to hide some of these places where I've gotten a little overexcited with the brush. And you can see I've got skin texture coming up here. So let's go ahead and add another layer on top of this. I'll select my blur layer again, and I'm going to increase its opacity back up close to 100, something like that. Now I can come back in here and start to obscure some of those areas and blend in the tones. That way I still maintain those highlights, but I haven't put in skin texture, which would have been very difficult to paint back in the day. Don't forget, the actual resolution of your image is somewhat limited by the scale of the texture that you're painting on. You can see this blur lets me blend in some of these areas, so we hide some of those brush strokes as well as the texture that we didn't want. And ultimately, of course, it's up to you how much of the brush strokes you want seen, what total effect you want, level of realism, style that you're trying to emulate. Hopefully, you'll take this technique and run with it to come up with something completely different. There we go. And don't be afraid to go back and forth on a few of these things. You'll have to iterate or repeat yourself with varying levels of build-up to get the look you want. we go. Smooth out her face. And I'm still following the contours as much as possible. I want to make sure that what I represent here would have been fairly likely had I not had the luxury of tools like, say, undo or multiple layers, blending modes, things like that. There we go. Okay, we're starting to get a little pale. So I'm going to go over this same layer a bit with the multiply blend mode in the source document. That'll be the first time we look at blending mode changes here. You can see she's looking a little powdery. I've gone a little over the other direction. So let's turn this to multiply, and you can see the blur is now multiplying with the base layer, so everything's much darker. But I'm going to pay attention mostly to the dark and mid tones and try and stay away from the highlights with this one. A larger brush, and I'm actually going to lower the opacity a bit so I have even more subtle control. And I'm making individual strokes now rather than scrubbing anything. There we go. And the reason for this is because I want, there's going to be a subtle transition between just right and too much, and it's easy to blow right past it. So work on shaping here. You can recover some of the brush strokes that you might have lost from adding some of the blur. Remember, we're working mostly in the shadow and darker areas here, so anything you think needs to be a little bit darker, think of this as kind of like a burning pass. If you're familiar with the photographic terms for dodging and burning. You're emphasizing the shadows and giving some more shape here. There we go. If we do the same thing in the hair, we can make some of these darker areas a little more rich. That's it. Maybe a couple of highlights brought down on the fabric also to give more texture of cross painting, or cross strokes, sorry. There we go. Now I find that if I work too quickly with this, I end up getting very muddy, ugly colors. And so I prefer to work slowly and kind of sneak up on the end result. Let's bring these highlights down a little. Yeah, see, I feel like I went a little bit far right there. There we go. Okay. Now let's go the other direction. I'm going to create another layer here. You can do this all in the same layer if you're confident with it, but just for sake of demonstration, I'm going to add yet another layer so you can see the difference. I'm going to change the blur mode to the blend mode to screen, and I'm going to turn on the impression layer behind there because I don't want to get too many of those details in there. So let's just touch up these highlights, reduce the brush size. We'll hit some of those high points like the bridge of the nose. And maybe these highlights in the eye to give them a little more oomph. Okay, on the lip. There we go. Okay. Let's take out some of that we just did and cover that up. Now traditionally, because you didn't have multiple undos, you might have to go over areas multiple times with different layers of paint. So it's okay to think in those terms also. Alright. And I think that'll do it for the painting part of this. So let's go ahead and jump into the texture areas. Grab some of these highlights. Oh, before I switch away from this, I mentioned earlier in the demo that you could also potentially use tool-based blending modes for some of these things. If I change, knowing that I'm painting from a screen layer, if I change here to screen also, as I build up on here and scrub over and over again, every bit of paint that I'm laying down now is combining and multiplying, or I'm sorry, blending with paint that's only on this layer. So as I continue to paint in these areas, it gets lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter, even though it's not that light in the original image, right? It's it's blending on the same layer. I don't really like that look, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to see that this is yet another way you could paint in your highlights and darks. Rather than changing the blending mode of the layers here, change the blend mode of the tool and see if that works for you also. But I'm going to get rid of that one for now. All right, let's go ahead and group these layers together. And let's add a color fill layer. And I already have the color that I want pasted in there. This is kind of a, I don't know, bad butterscotch sort of look. Set it to color. And let's bring down the opacity a bit. Now, I don't necessarily want the color applied uniformly everywhere. I want it mostly in these highlight areas. So I'm going to double click on here and use Blend If on the underlying layer. I'm going to bring the shadows up just till they start to encroach. You can see that transition. That means the color fill layer is only being applied to these lighter areas. So I can adjust that shadow transition where I want. There we go. And I hold Option or Alt and split this slider to make it a smoother transition. The reason I'm doing that is because the aging process would not have happened uniformly based on the colors. It would happen mostly to areas you've applied more paint to, and it would be more visible in lighter colors. Darker colors tended not to shift as much, and if they did, it might be a different color. Here we go. So let's get rid of that. Select OK. All right, so we've already started adding some aging. We need to fix a few things with some dodge and burn. So I have this really cool retouching toolkit panel that I'll give you a discount code for as part of the other files. Let's see, it's not popping up just yet. Hold on a moment. There we go. Okay, so now I have this retouching toolkit. I'm going to click Dodge and Burn, and what that does for me is it creates a set of curves. This adjustment layer is masked, and as I paint with white, I'm going to dodge this area. And same thing happens over here. If I paint with white on the mask, I'm going to darken the area. So let's go ahead and grab a regular brush, B tool here, and let's take a look at getting a soft edge, fairly large brush, right? Zero spacing. And in this case, I want flow to be about 1% and opacity can stay at 100. But let's work on the highlight areas first. Okay, so I'm going to bring up just a little bit around her eyes and her lips, call attention to them. There we go. We'll do a little bit of shaping under that eye, right there. That's probably all I really need. And we're going to go to the burn layer and very carefully go around these outside edges to bring it down. I really want to emphasize the transitions here. And if it goes a little too fast, you can always lower the opacity of that or change the curve that comes with it. If I do this and use the Properties panel, you can see this curve right here can be adjusted also. There we go. Let's go back to burn. I'm going to darken some of this down. And you can even lower the opacity if it's painting too quickly. And it's okay to let some of this go to black. That was one of the defining features, was that you lost detail in the shadows quite quickly for some of these looks, because the effect was really aimed at getting this overall glow, this chiaroscuro in relationship between light and dark, to capture something a little more ethereal. All right, let's darken just the iris a bit, eyebrows. There we go. So I'm going for kind of a dreamy effect. I'll leave that highlight in place. Let's bring the nose down a little. And this gives you an opportunity to do some additional shaping. A little far there. Let's erase some of that. This triangle is actually pretty important if you're simulating a Rembrandt style lighting. It's key. It's the defining feature. So you can work that in. But be careful because this transition affects how her face looks. So if I want that cheekbone a little bit softer, I can broaden that out a little. All right, so the transition is a little easier, and that affects the way she looks. Let's burn a little bit more on the mouth. There we go. This gives us a lot of dimensionality in the face, right? So if I turn off the dodge and burn layers, you can see it's quite a dramatic change. So the texture layers are next, and they're run almost exactly the same way, but they're actually a little bit easier to deal with. Let's do the face. I'm not going to worry about the background texture because it behaves exactly the same way. I have a paint layer that's also open, and the original image has color to it, and it's just this crackled paint look. The reason I chose this particular image is because the scale matched pretty well with the target document, and so I wanted to make sure that the cracks were going to be a reasonable size, right? So, and you'll see that when I start painting. It also has dimensions that are very similar. It doesn't have to be exact because I'm not trying to match perspective here, but it's also 300 dpi. It's also in RGB, so the color space is the same, and it's about 8 inches wide, so that's all the same. I desaturated it, and just for grins I added a sample layer at the top here. This is exactly the same kind of sample layer that we used in the other source document, meaning it's got a 0% fill and it's just a flat color. I'll grab my clone stamp tool yet again. Let's open up the clone source panel. I'll select another sample so I don't overwrite my original painting. The reason for that is in case I go back or decide to want to change something later before I close the documents, I want to make sure that I have it all squared away. So I'll just zoom out and select someplace at random. It doesn't really matter. I'm not going to worry about offset in this case, but I am going to go back to my target layer, and let's actually call that face texture. There we go. And I'll just start painting. I've got an opacity of 10% and flow of 10% left over from when we were doing the underpainting or detail painting. So I'm going to build up that texture slowly. The reason I want it in grayscale is because some of the blend modes will ignore middle gray. Right? And you'll notice I'm painting mostly in highlight areas at the moment. The reason for that is because you would have put up more paints in highlight areas, and so they're more susceptible to cracking. Plus, it's a little more visible there, even if it does happen in the other areas. And that gray is starting to show through, and it's changing the light values, and I don't really want that. So we need to figure out a way to deal with that. There are a bunch of blending modes you can try. Classic one is multiply, which typically ignores middle gray, and if you set your values properly, it'll blend the way you expect. Another one you can try is color burn, which is even a little more subtle. You can try darker color, but I don't necessarily, that's going to be kind of a crapshoot here unless you have a really calibrated eye. Soft light, overlay, a lot of those will work. I'm going to stick with color burn, and you can see right here the gray has started to darken some of these spots. So I'm going to double click on that layer and bring up my advanced blending options. And once again, we're going to tweak both of these sets of sliders. These may not be visible on the screen, but it's important to know that you can adjust both of these, and so that's why I'm showing it to you, because you'll definitely want control, because your colors will be different than what I'm painting with here. You know what, I'm going to leave that one all the way up and adjust this. Now this one, this top slider, is affecting what of the texture layer actually comes through rather than multiplying what's beneath it. So if there's something that's a middle gray value, that will become invisible, but there'll be a soft transition. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. Lower the opacity a little, and we can continue painting in some of these areas. Bring back some of that texture. Now you'll notice I've still got the texture aligned. If I wanted to go through and say add even more smaller cracks in these areas, it would be a very simple matter without changing my document or my sampler or anything else to add a new layer. I won't bother naming it at the moment, but I can come over here to my scale, and when I start dragging this, you'll see an overlay of your sample. And now you can kind of gauge the scale. You see how those are getting smaller? Now if I zoom in here, I want finer cracks, say where her eyes are. I can paint those in. And let's get an eraser right there. And we'll do the same thing, color burn. And I'm not going to bother with the blending modes on that. But now I can paint multiple versions of that texture if I need just a little more hint of fine aging, especially in these areas where there's transition. Right? Because the composition of the paint would have changed based on the pigment used. And so it wouldn't be uncommon to have cracks along boundaries that would be slightly different than cracks in larger areas. There. A little finishing touch with opacity, and then do the same thing on the background, and you have pretty much everything you need for your final image. Let's go ahead and put this all the way up. We'll show the before and after. So that's our final product. That's where we started. And of course, like I said previously, everything that you do is going to be a little bit different each time. So it doesn't look exactly like what I started with, but that's one of the beauties of this particular technique, is that you can do it multiple times and keep coming up with different looks based on how you feel at the moment. So hopefully this provides some more information. It gives you a lot more detail about how to step through the process. And more importantly, I hope it gives you a concept of the actual workflow so that you can work through this without having to pay attention to your steps. It just progresses naturally for you. If you have any questions, I will provide an email address. You are free to ask at any time about this or any other techniques. And I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks a lot. Bye.